your seats for our final session.
Exactly. You did say that earlier. I'm sorry, I forgot.
Okay, we're going to get started in our final panel today. My name is Daniel Strand. I'm professor of ethics at the Air War College. I'll be moderating this last panel. Continuing the ethics in law discussion, we've got two great presentations. Dr. David Lefkowitz from the University of Richmond teaches philosophy and law. He's going to be talking about
Rules for war.
Rules for war. And then after him, we'll have Yvonne Chiu speaking on conspiring with the enemy, some of the material out of her book, The Ethic of Cooperation in Warfare. So we will start with David.
All right, good afternoon. So I just want to begin with a quick thank you to Ed and to everyone at the Stockdale Center and the U.S. Naval Academy for inviting me back here and to speak with you today. And this is actually even easier in light of the last session because I can just spend 20 minutes throwing shade on Otto and Helen. See you over there. All right. So what I want to do with you today is to continue a conversation begun in the last session. I'm torn between two pictures of the relationship between the morality of war and the law of war. And as you'll see, I'm actually torn between two pictures of morality, although I'm trending strongly in one direction. And so what I want to do is invite you into a conversation about kind of my thoughts, what's kind of pulling me in one direction and the other. So I'm going to start by introducing these two pictures. I'm going to draw loosely on Seth Lazar's discussion of methodology and just war theory, in which he distinguishes between what he calls the morality first approach to rules for war, as exhibited, for instance, by Otto and Helen, and then the war first approach, which is sometimes associated with Michael Walzer, also Henry Chiu, and Yanina somewhere in here as well. So I want to start there. So I want to start by raising a challenge, a kind of nagging concern I have with the morality first approach, something very much along the lines that Otto presented. And then I want to consider two arguments for the war first approach to theorizing the relationship between the morality of war and the law of war. And I'm going to use as a kind of point of orientation two well-known claims by Henry Chiu. And then finally, I'm going to invite a discussion on the practical relevance of this theoretical debate. And there I'm going to stake out two skeptical claims. The first is, it's not clear to me that this debate has any repercussions for the content of the more concrete norms that should guide combatants in war. And secondly, I'm going to adopt or at least assert, a guardedly skeptical position on their importance for the moral education of combatants. So, I can do this quickly because the last session. So distinguish two broad approaches to theorizing the relationship between the morality of war and the law of war. We have first the morality first approach, and I cannot do any better than Otto in presenting that approach. So we first have a moral argument that tries to unearth, identify some general moral principles that govern interpersonal violence. They're general in the sense that they apply in all contexts. So in some sense, to speak of the morality of war is maybe a euphemism, really, because there's just the morality of interpersonal violence, and interpersonal violence can occur in war and also in other settings. And then we have a conception of law, and the purpose of law is to help people better conform to morality. So in some cases, that might just take the form of reducing the frequency with which people violate moral norms governing interpersonal violence. The war first approach, I don't want to give anything away, but it starts by thinking about war. All right. So we start with war. We begin by identifying features of war that distinguish it from other circumstances of social interaction. And then we justify the morality of war in terms of protecting and respecting fundamental interests in those circumstances. And sometimes that's the entire project. We just fully collapse the morality of war and the law of war into a single set of rules. We'll talk more about that. But even if we don't, we see the value of the law of war as being communicating the content of the morality of war. Okay, so first, my nagging concern with the morality first approach, something along the lines of what Otto sketched above, is prompted by this thought experiment from David Rodin. This will be familiar to some of you. Right, so he asks us to consider this hypothetical, this society, right, in which there's this macabre tradition in which the ethnic majority once a year to celebrate the birth of the country or some such thing, strings up a member of the ethnic minority. Right? Now, that's illegal. It's a violation of the prohibition on murder in this community. And yet, whenever the government has tried to step in to prevent this, to enforce the law, the ensuing violence carried out by the ethnic majority has actually been, against the minority has actually been much greater. Right? And so, acting with a humane motive, the government then decides to enact a law in which once a year, right, there's going to be a specific ritual. The majority will follow that ritual as laid out in the law, and as long as they conform to the law's guidelines on how to carry out the ritual, which is the ritual of lynching a member of the ethnic minority, right, there will be no consequences. Rodin rejects this law. He says such a law would not be justifiable. Because it treats a member of the ethnic minority as a mere means, right? It fails to take seriously every member of the minority's moral right, right, not to be killed by the majority for these kind of macabre ritualistic purposes. Right? And he draws the same conclusion when it comes to the instrumental justification of the law of war. The idea that we should tell combatants to follow certain rules even when they're morally unjustified in going to war in the first place, and so every attack they carry out will in fact be an unjust killing, right? And say, well, you know, from a humane motive, or maybe the motive of trying to reduce the incidence of wrongful killings, we should tell them it's okay. Right? He says that is not a justifiable approach. That is not a sufficient or acceptable justification for the law of war. So I've kind of canvassed in some other writing various kinds of responses, and this is not really a full list. And I have to confess that maybe a little bit of the steam behind this argument has been taken away by the fact that Otto says, yeah, it's just a consequentialist justification. Right? Well, I'm not really sure that that's true, and I think maybe it's still reason to be dissatisfied with it. So for reasons of time, I'm not really going to belabor each of these, although I'm happy to talk about them with you, except I will say a little bit about that second bullet point there, right? Because this is the position that Otto, this is the characterization of the law of war that Otto mentioned in his remarks. And I'm trying to think whether if you're a victim of the ethnic minority, you would feel like it would be any better from your perspective if the state said, look, we're not saying it's okay. We're not saying anybody has a liberty to string you up, right? In fact, we've left a law that says when they do that, that's going to be illegal. We're just saying and publicly conveying to everyone that we're not going to prosecute or punish anyone if they do that. And it seems to me from the standpoint of the members of the ethnic minority that they won't feel any less like they're being treated as a mere means, that their rights are not, in fact, being recognized, just because it's an immunity and not a liberty. Happy to say more about that, but I'm just going to keep saying controversial things and move on to talk a little bit about the war-first approach. So again, I want to take as my starting point two claims that Henry Chiu has advanced. The first is that contrary to the morality-first approach, the crucial distinction in theorizing rules for war is not between morality and law, but between war and peace. And that secondly, once we've worked out the morally best law of war, we have the morality of war. There is not going to still be some second set of norms governing the conduct of war. So let's start with the first claim. The content of the rules governing permissible interpersonal violence in war differ significantly from those governing interpersonal violence in peace. Right? And Chiu's primary argument for this claim invokes the dictum ought implies can. Right, so he says, insofar as the rules for war specify what combatants ought and ought not to do, they must be ones that combatants can use to guide their conduct. And then he mentions some of the same factors that Otto mentioned to justify following the law of war rather than trying to act directly on the morality of war. That is, on the morality first account of the morality of war. And so these include things like information, poverty, and cognitive constraints. Now, as we just saw in the previous session, these factors can be mobilized to justify adhering to a law of war that in its content differs significantly from the morality of war, right? That's the picture we had. And so sometimes that claim has been advanced against Chiu, right? That Chiu was just confused, and this is the kind of picture he ought to have offered. I just want to note, it's not the one he offers, at least I don't believe it is. And so as he says, right, you cannot be morally required, even in so-called ideal theory, to do what it is in fact impossible to do. But this might misconstrue the ought implies can dictum. So it may be true that the rules for war must be ones that combatants can conform to, but the possibility of doing so need not depend on combatants achieving conformity to those norms by using them to guide their conduct. Now, I think that's actually a coherent position. Again, I'm kind of torn between these two pictures. But my sympathy does still lie with Chiu and his intuition that it is an essential feature of any norm that those subject to it should normally be able to use it to guide their conduct. And I think to defend that intuition, we need to take a position on the nature of moral norms. So, this is either going to be a reductio ad absurdum or a compelling argument, and I haven't decided yet which one it is. So, Robert Brandom, esteemed philosopher at the University of Pittsburgh, describes the history of Enlightenment philosophy as proceeding in two stages. Philosophers in the first stage take their inspiration from physics, and so they defend what I'm going to call the physics model of morality. And it'll look familiar to you. It's the view that morality, right, governs human interaction and is composed of abstract, universal, unchanging, and necessarily binding principles. But philosophers in the second stage of the Enlightenment, right, so romantics and especially the pragmatists, take their inspiration from biology and so defend what I will call the biological model of morality. And on that account, right, human interaction is governed by concrete, local, or contextual, contingent, and mutable norms that reflect an ongoing process of mutual accommodation among particular creatures in a specific habitat. So these I can give you two representative quotes that convey the essence of these two models of morality. The first one comes from Jeff McMahon in a book chapter on the law of war, in which he says, law is an artifact consciously designed to serve certain purposes, whereas morality is not. I believe that morality is for the most part discovered, not made. It is what it is, whether it works for us or not. And we can contrast that, which I think is a nice statement of the physics model, with a second quote, this one from John Dewey. Morality is not a fixed and final thing, neither a catalog of acts nor a set of rules to be applied like cookbook recipes that exist out there in the universe. Rather, morality is a tool that people use to organize their interaction with others, with the regulative aim of living together on terms that all accept as appropriate. Now let's suppose we were to adopt a biological understanding of moral norms, and indeed of all norms. Where would that leave us? Well, I think it has a number of important implications, right, including for the norms that govern war. The first implication is that moral arguments are testable hypotheses. Right? And the test is that of experience. So we can say that the proof is in the pudding. Right? The question is, when we attempt to govern social interaction, our social interaction in a particular circumstance or situation, in accordance with some norm N rather than some norm M, do we thereby better realize some regulative ideal or better advance or honor some value? Right. That's a question that can only be answered by living that norm. Right? What kind of life world do we in fact realize when we try to live in accordance with those norms? It also has some implications about the limits of thought experiments. Right? So 2 things to note here. The first is that when we are asked about our intuitions in thought experiments, at best what we're revealing is our kind of present level of skill at navigating familiar social situations. Right? Importantly, right, it is a skill, right? Again, coming back to the kind of biological model here, a kind of activity that we engage in. Now, it doesn't mean that thought experiments have no value. Right? First of all, the situation in which our intuitions are solicited might be the same in all the relevant respects as some other situation we're being asked to consider, but of course it might not be, in which case our intuition, our skill, may not translate. You may know the right way to act so that you don't offend your host in one setting, and yet, right, when you go into another setting, following those same set of norms may not produce the same result, may not, in fact, serve to advance or honor the relevant value. Thought experiments may also be useful for generating hypotheses, right, for imagining ways that the world might be, but it's really important not to confuse, right, a vision of how the world might be, of the social world we might achieve, with the claim that such a social world actually already exists. And here, right, say something that sounds, I think, obvious, but maybe easy to lose track of. Right? So architectural drawings are not a building. And whether the envisioned structure can be built and so provide the goods that it promises if it is built depends on the actual capacities of the builders, the materials available to them, the features of the environment in which they build, and not least whether the clients strive to preserve the original structure and shape their lives to fit into it, or instead redesign the building to accommodate their goals and desires. Another implication of the biological model of norms concerns the existence conditions for norms. Again, norms are not out there in the universe, some kind of cookbook, right, that we can then draw on and apply to situations as we encounter them. Rather, norms exist in virtue of their successful use in concrete practices of holding accountable. And when I talk about holding accountable, I mean both kind of using the norm to hold yourself to account, that is to use it to guide your conduct and say, I ought to do this and not that, but also kind of holding people accountable by, for instance, criticizing them, right, for failing to adhere to some norm that you maintain they ought to have followed. Again, this has important implications for the content of norms. So we might formulate a putative norm that requires agents to do X. Right? But if it turns out that few agents in the relevant circumstances actually use that norm to hold themselves accountable, then our putative norm is at best an aspirational norm, not an actual one that the agents here have simply failed to recognize. A third implication has to do with the kind of contextual or environmental element of norms, or in thinking about norms. So it's really important that we pay attention to the environment in which the norms are to be deployed. What features of that environment will either strengthen or weaken their use? What features of the environment are conducive to their flourishing or their withering or the stunting of a practice of holding accountable? Right. And here I want to, again, connect with an observation that Chiu has made, but I think also connects with some of the questions that have been asked today. And that concerns the presence or absence of the rule of law in international affairs. So this would take much too long for me to defend, so I'm just going to assert it. And that is that fidelity to the ideal of the rule of law is the sine qua non of a social order premised on right, not might. A culture of fidelity to the ideal of the rule of law can only flourish in the presence of impartial adjudicatory institutions, however, and it frequently, though perhaps not necessarily, requires third-party enforcement. Both of these are absent in war. War is indeed politics by other means in which success is achieved on the basis of might, not right. And that's why I concur with Chiu's observation that it would hardly be surprising if the best rules that could govern such an anarchic, violent realm as international conflict differed significantly from those governing life in a rule of law society. I'm just going to leave you with the cruel tease on the first question, because I'm just out of time, and I do want to, again, stake these bold claims. So I have a hypothesis, and I don't yet have good evidence for it, nor do I have good evidence against it. And my hypothesis is this, that the concrete norms that would flow from either one of these approaches to theorizing the morality of war and its relationship to the law of war, the concrete norms guiding combatants will be the same. So that the downstream implications of these debates don't matter. Now, I'm open to seeing that challenge, but I've read Otto's excellent book, for example, and it is an excellent book. And when I look at some of the claims that say, well, the law of war should be revised in this particular way because it would better serve the aim of increasing conformity to the morality of war, every single one of those suggestions, I look at it and I say, you know what, it seems to me that an advocate of the humanitarian approach to justifying the law of war could probably say the same thing. Of course, their reasons would be different, right? But nevertheless, both parties would end up supporting the same kind of specific reform to a more concrete rule governing war. And because of that, it even makes me question the relevance of these debates, perhaps, to the moral education of combatants. Right? So perhaps what matters is that they learn these rules. Right? And we might even say, and these rules are actually warranted by a variety of moral arguments. Perhaps we could add other moral practices as well, such as the honorable warrior code of a particular military tradition. Right? But really our approach to moral education of combatants should be what I'm going to call the Maritanian approach, right? In which we would assert, right, that these are the correct rules for waging war, just don't ask us what justifies them. Right? Anyway, I've run out of time, and I hope I've said more than enough to provoke you, so thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Whoa. All right. Good afternoon. So I hope this is not an omen of some kind. All right. So thanks for having me. I'm going to close out the afternoon for you guys by talking about some of the tensions between the ethics and the laws of war. I'm going to start by talking about the tension between fair fight ethics and the laws about civilian immunity, and use that to discuss some of the unintended consequences of ethical and legal restrictions, and then get to the fundamental question that raises about what war is trying to achieve. So I'm going to start talking about the ethics of a fair fight, which I think actually has aspects of both the biological and physics models of norms that David Lefkowitz was just talking about. So warriors throughout history, across cultures, they have valued not just winning, but winning in a particular way, which is to say fairly. Now, the huge caveat on this is that this is not in every case or in every instance, but there is a significant tendency, and that gets reflected in both norms and laws. And this tendency comes from a number of sources. There is a recognition of shared humanity. There's often a mutual respect for your fellow warrior. There's also a self-perception, or a desire to perceive oneself as a warrior and not as a murderer. And this can be tied up with virtue ethics arguments about morality of war, and this includes, focusing on, for example, you see this, when in certain laws of war, for example, when you focus on utility for battle. The Libra Code, for example, mandates that you cannot intentionally inflict additional injury, or kill an enemy who's already wholly disabled, right? And to do so is punishable by death. And that's because somebody who's wholly disabled doesn't serve a battle function, right? Their incapacity effectively removes them from the battlefield, and to kill them then would be to murder, right? Not to justifiably kill in war. There's also sources in professional ethics, right, that's driving this. And so the concern, with these fair fight ethics is that some circumstances do not seem to constitute warfare, or at least are inconsistent with the spirit of war. And in those cases, the enemy might not receive his due consideration, and that is a genuine chance of defending himself or herself. However, once a warfighter enters into conflict, they expect to be killed at any time, right? You can be killed on patrol, at a rear operating base, during a supply convoy run, while you're sleeping, any other circumstances that are outside of actual fighting. And so in this context, fairness doesn't seem to make much sense. And so one of the questions, of course, is why this ethic has made its way into thinking about war. And what that actually means. So this conception of fairness is really a conception, it manifests in a lot of ways, but one way it manifests is this, a conception of fairness as an equal opportunity, and that is, an equal chance of success, not unduly unfavorable to anyone. And here it'd be more like a Hobbesian natural equality, that people have a sporting chance, right? It's not a reasonable but not certain chance. And again, you can see this reflected in the law. So, for example, with uniform conventions, right? The Geneva Conventions require that combatants have to distinguish themselves by wearing either uniforms or some other identifiable mark, or by carrying their arms openly into combat. And that is so that to make sure that that combatants are fighting each other rather than combatants and civilians, right? So this. As you know, is reflected in the law. There's both customary international law, that, there's a principle of, the first customary international law is the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. They must be distinguished at all times. You can only attack combatants. You cannot direct attacks against civilians. The Fourth Geneva Conventions is, full of protections of, the ways in which you have to protect civilians in times of war. And so these laws about civilian immunity are reflecting a number of ethical concerns, not exclusively, but including that of fair fight ethics, so that war should stay between warriors. So, but there are a number of tensions between the ethics and the laws that get manifested in different ways. And first thing I'm going to talk about is with discriminating weapons. So one major way to safeguard civilian immunity is to limit the use of indiscriminate weapons. You can either restrict or ban their outright use, or you can actually try to develop better technology that will make weapons more discriminating. So, for example, time-limited landmines, precision-guided munitions of various kinds, including laser, satellite munitions fired from long range or remotely piloted vehicles. But this is where you get the double-edged sword of technology. When you actually target properly, right, these smarter weapons can greatly reduce collateral damage to civilians, which can be much more precise than sending in ground troops, for example. But when you have improved targeting capabilities, this raises a couple of concerns. One is that you actually start to get a disconnect with expectations. So so empirically, it's unclear whether wartime atrocities with these smarter weapons in kind of limited circumstances are worse than fighting a full-scale conventional war. Right? But often seems that if it's worse, because there's something about the large scale of conventional war and its technological developments that are associated with killing both more and fewer civilians. Right? So chemical and biological weapons, as well as ever more powerful bombs, they can kill on an almost inconceivable scale. And scaling up war inevitably means killing more civilians in absolute terms, absolute numbers. But so long as there are reasonable attempts made to properly target then increasing the accuracy means killing proportionally fewer civilians. But when you do that, then you increase expectations for fewer casualties. So the more technologically advanced, the more targeted you can make your technology, the greater the expectations for killing fewer civilians. And now you have this glaring gap between contemporary expectations and the practice of warfare, and it enhances the perception that things have gotten worse. So ironically, when there was no legal requirements for restraint, or the norms had not yet caught up with the technology, when you didn't have any legal or normative requirements for restraint or humanitarianism or discrimination, then unfortunately there was nothing to be disappointed about, right? But now we have great cause to be disappointed because the technology could allow us to kill fewer civilians. So that's one phenomenon. The other is, these fair fight considerations, right? A lot of people view advanced targeted weaponry with ambivalence and suspicion, and that's because it does run afoul of this notion of fair fights, right? I mean, there is no sense in which, a warfighter on the ground can fight back against, satellite-guided munition, being controlled from 7,000 miles away, right? So he's not being given a sporting chance, a sporting opportunity. Now, whichever direction you reconcile this tension between these fair fight ethics and civilian immunity, it presents problems. If you want to resolve it in favor of fair fights, then you'd want to restrict the use of targeted long-range munitions. Unfortunately, civilians will then absorb more casualties because closer range combat will cause more collateral damage, especially in densely populated areas where the drone strikes would actually be more effective. And given existing rules of engagement for both these scenarios, civilian casualties from ground operations are going to outnumber the civilian casualties from targeted drone strikes. So from the perspective of saving lives, it's better to use the remote advanced technology. But how civilians die makes a difference to how people perceive those deaths. And a large number of civilian deaths from closer range battle, where there might at least be the veneer of a possibility of fighting back, that might actually seem more acceptable than fewer deaths of victims who may not even have known that an attack was coming. So, on the other hand, if you resolve this tension in favor of civilian protection, then you want to use targeted weaponry as much as possible, right? And then you have these short to medium-run utilitarian calculations of civilian deaths, that say you should target more. But the long-term calculation is unclear, right? This perceived unfairness from those resulting deaths, even if they're few in number, might further inflame resentments. They might aggravate the conflict in the long run. So the calculation on how you resolve this is complicated. And I think these challenges with discrimination raise a number of concerns. And over time, the ethics and laws of war have been increasingly concerned with discrimination. They've tried ever harder to protect civilians, to restrict the use of certain types of weapons. What's interesting is there are also limits in the norms and in the law to how much discrimination we actually want, right? And it turns out that apparently we don't want too much discrimination to be exercised either. So, for example, you can look at both in the legal realm, the accountability gap for political leaders, right? Political leaders, let's just say in liberal democratic systems, right? The political leaders are the one who are morally responsible for the war, but they are not legally held accountable except in some limited types of cases. And so there is this large gap between the moral responsibility for war and the actual legal ramifications. Also, you can look at some of another place in which we kind of don't want too much, people often don't want too much discrimination, is the use of snipers, right? Sniping is legal combat, but it is seen as problematic in some ways. So, it is only recently that snipers have acquired a noble and heroic reputation, right? Historically, they were actually disdained for unfairly and dishonorably killing someone from far away who didn't even know that they were there. So sometimes there are lots of stories in in the literature about snipers sometimes holding back because they themselves felt a little uneasy about the particular circumstances they were presented. There was also lots of stories of general hatred of snipers, even by their own colleagues, right? Both of these things actually reflect some attempt to constrain some of the randomness of war and a desire to try to impose some modicum of order. And that's because war, especially these large-scale conflicts between conscripted nation-state militaries, they're using broad and long-range weapons. It's a haphazard, confusing, anonymous, and very accidental process. And so surviving is often largely a matter of luck. And it's easy to see how soldiers, would resent being targeted by snipers in this way. But this is, so this again raises an interesting conundrum, right? Because sniping is a very effective way of killing. Insofar as wars are won by killing, then considerations of fairness, again, ought to have no part in this very narrow and purely functional vision of war. So this leads us to questions about unintended consequences and greater harm, right? And one of the panels earlier, there was a mention of, I believe it was Professor Dr. Neff mentioned it, where there's been a long-standing concern since the 19th century, at least, that humanitarian measures can prolong war and they can increase overall harm, right? And the idea is that when you protect certain classes of people, when you restrict warfighting, it could make it harder to win the war, and ironically, ultimately do more damage. And you can see some of this stuff at work in, for example, humanitarian pauses and ceasefires, where people actually, the whole point of the humanitarian pause or the ceasefire is so you can resupply civilians, you can attend to their human needs, and it is very well intentioned, but the unintended consequence is that these pauses can often enable both sides to rearm. Money is fungible, and resources and aid that is given for humanitarian purposes are often easily diverted, if not outright stolen. It often is used in ways that prop up bad regimes. There's a whole separate literature on international aid, right, and the ways in which it works and doesn't work with bad regimes. But the fundamental concern is that humanitarian pauses and ceasefires, they actually are just postponing what you have to have, which is military victory, right? That is the thing that ends a conflict. So caring about the humanitarian considerations of the civilians just postpones a day in which one side or other can actually prevail. So there again, there's this whole literature about, well, short, sharp wars are faster, right? And you can see this, but Lieber talked about it, Sherman, Frederick the Great, Machiavelli, any number of people are concerned with the unintended consequences of humanitarian considerations. And I think the reason that we get one of the reasons we get this tension is because that the ethics and laws of war are sometimes aiming at different things. And I want to distinguish between the battle function and war function. So the ultimate aim of most wars is to end fighting and to enact a sustainable political solution as quickly as possible. On the other hand, things like fair fight ethics, and humanitarian protections, they don't have a direct relationship with producing the result for war. And so these purposes are running along often non-intersecting and sometimes contradictory tracks. So, on some understandings of warfare, and certainly most modern ones, physical comparability between nations and soldiers doesn't really have any place because the war isn't really about the physical fight, right? The military objective of defeating the enemy in the battlefield is only relevant in the service of the overarching political goal. And this is the Clausewitzian perspective, right? The point of war is to impose our will upon the enemy. And warfare is the political tool. It is not the end in and of itself. And so, so wars actually not really about the contest of, it is a contest of physical prowess and military expertise and strategic acumen, but it's not about that, right? That's not the purpose. What war really is a method of dispute resolution, whether it's a geopolitical contest or disagreement about justice. And so this becomes especially, interestingly, this becomes especially salient as combat technology advances further, right? The more high-tech a war becomes, the less relevant the martial skill actually becomes. So to the degree that some forms of fighting may not really have anything to do with martial prowess at all. This raises these separate questions, but it does highlight the ways in which, in some sense, the physical activity of war can be, or the physical activity of war is incidental, right? The primary purpose is to induce a political or judicial rendering. So this raises, I want to raise two questions to end this. One is, if humanitarian restrictions and ethics of war can actually prolong war and its suffering, then why might we want to retain these regulations beyond concerns with human rights? One is, I think, the significance within battle function. So people who are moved to practice fair fight ethics are not usually thinking about the war's overarching political and judicial or justicial objectives. They often hold independent reasons for fighting fairly. Right, and so I think for a lot of warfighters, there is little connection between their actions and interests, in battle and this larger geopolitical conflict. And so as a result, the activities of their daily lives, which is killing the enemy and surviving, those become ends in themselves. And so it's not surprising that warfighters would want to both become better at these tasks and also to establish some norms for those tasks, because that is something that allows them to continue on in what is, in many ways, a very horrific and barbaric activity. There is a strong human desire to make sense of what is often inexplicable, to make sense of an incomprehensible calamity, right? And more so for the people who suffer that directly. So I think for a lot of warfighters, because the physical engagement is the world that they know, they focus on bringing order to what they can control. And so this is one of the ways in which they look for meaning, is by actually trying to establish and adhere to various ethics of fighting, right? This, again, raises some questions about what's the best way to win, right? Should we have duels between political leaders? This will also help address the accountability gap that I talked about. Might not be a bad idea. There's also structural cooperation. You can design some kind of structures, to try to end, design war in a way that you can end it very quickly. That's something I talk about in other places. But I think the fundamental question it raises at the very end is, a question about what war is for, right? If you taking a sober look at the adverse effects and devastating costs of warfare and of trying to fight well and to make war more humane, we're asking fundamental questions about whether the norms of war should more directly address the function of war, which is to settle political disputes. But war has another major goal as well, and that is, in addition to the political settlement, war is also meant to render deontological justice more broadly, right? To achieve jus ad bellum. And I think the pursuit of jus ad bellum is a question that's been largely vacated in the modern laws of war. And so perhaps we should inquire into not just what content should occupy conclusive political settlements for the war, but also the ways in which jus ad bellum might be addressed. So modern laws of war, are based, I think they focus very much on, their focus on jus ad bellum is mostly quite narrow, which is, everyone agrees self-defense is a justifiable cause, right? But beyond that, things get much more complicated. And modern laws of war don't have they have other things to say about jus ad bellum, but not that much more. And that's partly because it is complex and contested, and it is in many ways much easier to focus on the jus in bello norms and laws. But as we are thinking about, the geopolitical purposes that war serves, we should also not forget the deontological and the justicial purposes of war. And this is where I think it raises a whole new set of questions about tensions between, the ethics and laws of war. And it's something I'm sure we will get to talk about tomorrow. So thank you very much.
Questions? Feel free to walk up to the mic.